Good morning, Exeter. Good morning. So before I introduce today's Assembly Speaker, for those seniors who are with us this morning, I want you to know that over the weekend, I signed all your diplomas. And I would like to use them all. I think you get my drift. So our Assembly Speaker this morning is Mr. Andrew Laszlo, Exeter class of 1970. I was a year behind Mr. Laszlo at Exeter, and we were hockey teammates. But of greater relevance this morning, Mr. Laszlo and I went to the same elementary school, and I visited him in his home and met his father. Mr. Laszlo is here today to tell his father's life story. It's a life story that traces its origins to the Holocaust, to time in a labor camp, and eventually to immigration to the United States. It's a story of loss, survival, perseverance, resilience, and ultimately success. It's a truly remarkable story, as you will soon hear. We have with us this morning several members of the class of 1970, and I hope many are watching remotely, so I just want to welcome the class of 70 to Assembly. This assembly was first planned a year ago and originally was scheduled for last December, and for a variety of reasons we had to reschedule it. But as it turns out, it's really a more timely assembly today, because a week ago yesterday was Yom HaShoah, or International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We observe this in Shabbat with a Holocaust Remembrance service. And next year, we will have in our regular assembly schedule a Holocaust Remembrance Day assembly, as we have had in prior years. Mr. Laszlo's talk usually takes about 50 minutes. This morning, he will speak for 30 minutes, which is a little bit longer than a normal assembly. He will be available in the Elting room over lunch to tell you much more and to answer your questions. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Laszlo to our school this morning.
Thank you, Principal Rawson, my old friend. Many of you in this audience are 18 years old, and before I get started, I just want you to know that that was how old my father was when he went into his first concentration camp. This is the house he grew up in Papa, Hungary, which he shared with his mother, father, and older brother, Zondor. This was my grandfather, a World War I hero. He was a big, strong man. He thought his country would stand up for their war heroes, and he was wrong. The Nazi doctrine was that anyone who had one drop of Jewish blood going back 4 generations, anyone, was deemed a Jew and targeted for extermination. My father, second from left, was a great athlete. He was on the Hungarian junior national teams in figure skating and fencing, being groomed for the Olympic Games. And if you look at the smiles on these kids' faces, they had no idea what was waiting for them. And then things started to change. The Graf Zeppelin flew over Papa, and my father saw his first swastika on the tail. They got their first radio, and an early program featured a young, boisterous, upcoming German politician. It was my father's first experience with Adolf Hitler. And then things did change. He was no longer allowed to march with his school. He was kicked off the junior national teams and the pre-Olympic teams. And worst of all, his fencing coach, mentor, second father figure told him that he would no longer coach him because he was a Jew. And then in And then in March of 1944, the Germans invaded Hungary, and my father wrote,
"As I warned you, lots of my past life's aspects are difficult to talk about. Very probably hard for you to understand, and reading it might cause discomfort. Yes, from here on, this account is going to get rough."
Things changed quickly. They were evicted from their beautiful house and taken to live in the Papa Ghetto, where they shared one small room with 3 other families. They were allowed 1 suitcase of possessions each. And that's where my father's instincts started to kick in. He started to do things others didn't. He made many trips back to his house at night, and with the possessions he couldn't take with him, he hid them in caches which he buried around the countryside. The caches all contained tools, food, medicine, and some money and warm clothing, things that helped him survive. On his last trip to his old house, he took a sledgehammer and broke all their china. If he couldn't eat off it, the Nazis wouldn't either. In June of 1944, he was conscripted into the labor service. That's his picture wearing the labor service uniform with the yellow armband that Jews were forced to wear. The Nazis took the strong and put them to work. The weak, like his mother, were taken to concentration camps and killed. On the day he left for the labor service, his father risked his life by walking him out of the ghetto, which was illegal, and taking him to the train station, where he gave him his last advice, which was to shave every day. More on that later. It was the last day also that he ever saw his mother. His job at the labor camp was to build tracks for the German railroads, and he worked hard at that. At night, when no one was looking, he poured sand into the gearboxes. He knew they would seize, and trains carrying German soldiers and supplies would be stranded on the tracks he was forced to build. He had built a knapsack, a special one. It was waterproofed. There was leather sewn in the back, which he used to sew extra soles on his shoes to keep them from freezing. And he hid money and tools and medicine in the armbands. He kept it with him at all times. One day, the Allies bombed the camp, and there was just a minute or 2 of chaos. Because he had his knapsack with him and was ready, he was able to escape. Those who weren't prepared worked until they were too weak to work, and then they were murdered. While he was running away from the bombing, he got hit in the leg with shrapnel and a rod pierced his calf. He was able to pull it out, treat it with iodine from his pack, and sew it together, suture it with his sewing kit. Yet much of the shrapnel stayed in his leg for the rest of his life. While he was on the lam, his greatest fear were not the Germans. It was the Nyalazuk, the Hungarian Nazi Party, also known as the Arrow Cross for the patch they wore. They would randomly stop people on the street. They were more brutal than the Germans. They would stop people to beat them or torture them. They would kill their own countrymen, even former friends, without remorse. For entertainment, they would line Jews up on the bridge, shoot them like ducks in a shooting gallery, watching with amusement as they fell into the river one by one. One day, my father was surprised by a group of Nyalazak. He was a labor camp deserter, so he carried no papers, and without papers, he could have been killed on the spot. Rather than run, he walked up to the squadron leader and asked for directions to Varus Liget. He said the Germans across the street had sent him there on an errand. The squadron leader pointed him in the right direction, and off he went. In October of 1944, he was captured and taken to the train station. He wrote,
"The cars were so crowded that when the train moved, nobody in the car even swayed. We were jammed one against the other like sardines. Though there were small barbed wire covered windows at each end, the air in the car was unbearably hot, humid, and without oxygen."
His instinct kicked in again. He boarded the train and stood by the window where he would get an occasional breath of fresh air. He took postcards and folded them together and pushed them through the window to create a channel for rainwater to trickle in, and he had some bacon sewed into his clothes. Those in the center of the train were not as fortunate. During the 10-day ride, the doors were not open once. Many of them died from suffocation, lack of water, or being overcome by waste products. When he arrived at Bergen-Belsen, the concentration camp, he and other survivors walked off the train above and around dead and rotting bodies. Bergen-Belsen was not a death by gas chamber camp. It was a camp where people died from neglect. They starved to death, they froze to death. When my father walked in, he wrote,
"Nothing could have prepared us for the horror that greeted us. In whatever direction we looked, heaps of naked corpses were piled like cordwood in front of the dark barracks, surrounded by zombie-looking walking skeletons."
People died from starvation, they died from freezing. We found out Anne Frank was there at the same time as my father. She was bitten to death by fleas and lice, some of which carried typhus. One day while he was at the camp, a cart of dead bodies rolled by, and the person pushing the cart yelled out to him by his nickname Bondi, which was a nickname very few people knew. He didn't recognize the person, they weren't allowed to stop and talk, but he thought it might have been his brother. I found out later it was a brother, his brother, when I was researching this. The sight of his brother standing on the hill when he looked around, skin and bones, a walking skeleton staring at him, and not being able to help, was an image that stuck with my father for the rest of his life. That's my father, and that's his brother Zandor, sitting on their grandmother's lap. She died at Auschwitz also. My father was a big man. Principal Rawson knew him, a couple of my classmates knew him. He was over 6'3", but at Belsen he dropped down below 90 pounds. But he never lost his humanity. He shared his bi-daily potato with a pregnant woman who needed the food more than he did. He thinks the child was born alive, but he never found out if it survived the camp. This is a picture of the open pit grave at Bergen-Belsen, which my father would walk by daily. Eisenhower ordered his photographers to take pictures like these. He said without them, no one would believe the Holocaust ever happened. My father wasn't in this picture, but he could have been. His brother probably was. In the future, it could be you or me or anyone that's deemed undesirable by a totalitarian regime. The open pit at Belsen is the end game, when one ideology controls all three branches of government and the free press, and good people don't speak out from the beginning. In March of 1945, he was put on a train with others and sent away. No one knows why. The prevailing thought is that the Germans knew the Allies were coming and wanted more time to kill their prisoners. But he and the others thought that they might be headed to freedom on a prisoner exchange. It was a spring day with a warm wind and green grass, and he wrote that once again, for a short time, he felt the joy of life. But that joy was short-lived. The Germans had mounted anti-aircraft guns on the train, and the Allies mistook it for a troop transport and bombed it. During the bombing, my father and his friend Frogface were able to kick open a door and run to the forest. As they were running no farther apart than Mr. Miller and I, his friend Frogface was hit with ordnance and blown to pieces. My father survived again. After the bombing, they got back on the train. My father organized a group to throw the guns off the cars and paint red crosses on the roof, and they made it to Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was the Germans' propaganda camp. They filmed feasts and festivals to try to convince the world that they were good to their captives. But when the filming stopped, it was just as horrific as any other. Tens of thousands died. That's the Hanover Barracks, the building that my father was interned in. When he walked in, he wrote,
"The building was teeming with the most wretched-looking humanity."
Interesting words for someone who had just spent 6 months at Belsen watching people die by inches. The first thing he did was look for survivors from Papa, and he was told there was a man about 45 in the barracks across the yard. They weren't allowed to go outside, but my father found a tunnel underneath the yard, and sure enough, when he got there, he found his father. They were both in such terrible, emaciated shape that they didn't recognize each other. But when they did, his father, the big, strong war hero, started crying uncontrollably, and it was a long time before he could talk. His first words were, "Nagzam Migbretek." They beat me terribly. The Nazis had beat him every day to try to make him submit, and he never would. He told my father that he had survived Auschwitz, Birkenau, Buchenwald, and a 100-mile death march to Theresienstadt. During the march, he carried his friend Bolo, who couldn't walk, until his friend died in his arms. My grandfather was a real hero. After a couple days of visiting, he contracted typhus, and the end was near. My father watched them load him into an ambulance. And the ambulances those days didn't take you to a hospital. They took you to dump in a countryside in some ravine where you couldn't infect others. That's another image that stuck with him for the rest of his life. The last time he saw his father, he vowed he would kill any Nazi that he saw, and that resolve would be tested on the next slide. In May of 1945, the Germans surrendered and things got worse. There was no longer any food and water. My father formed a gang and they made daily forays into the countryside. On their first trip, or one of their first trips, they surprised a young German officer still in uniform, and my father was able to take his gun. His first thought was to shoot the man. Remember what he said when his father was taken away. But at the end of the day, he couldn't do it. He said it might have been a young man going home to see his mother and family. Elie Wiesel, the famous Holocaust survivor, said the same thing with different words. He said, "Only the guilty are guilty. The children of killers are not killers, they are children." On another trip, they broke into a house looking for food and found a piano. And it so happened that in their group was Fraser Dury, a highly regarded pianist. They urged him to play, but he was reluctant. He didn't know if his bony fingers would perform. When he did, the first song was "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes." And my father, who was starving, wrote,
The sounds filled the air with beauty, humanity, and an indescribable joy of being alive.
Music has the power to comfort the unfortunate and troubled. And the story didn't end there. 10 years later in New York, my father was filming an event at Rockefeller Center in the Rainbow Room and heard a piano that sounded familiar. When he approached, there sat Fraser Dury, now known as George Bayer. They recognized, embraced, and Bayer played "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes" again. Bayer had become a famous musician, a fixture in the New York nightclub circuit. He was even mentioned by Ian Fleming, the James Bond book.
All who love are blind.
He told my father that he didn't know if he would have ever played the piano again, but for the encouragement that day of his friends in Theresienstadt. And as I tell the story, I think it's important to know that beautiful stories sometimes are born in terrible times. So, shortly thereafter, the Red Cross took over Theresienstadt and things got better. My father regained his strength and weight and was ready to go home. They told him to stop in the Red Cross office in Prague, where he would be given, with all other survivors, 1,000 koruna. When they walked in the office, the man behind the desk said, "Well, we're all out of money, but I'll give you 20 koruna from my own pocket. Here, sign this," which was a paper in Czechoslovakian. He didn't think my father could read it, but he didn't know my father, who figured out that he was signing a receipt for 1,000 koruna. The Red Cross office was giving everybody 20 and keeping the rest for themselves. When my father figured that out, he broke into the Red Cross office later and took all the money out of the safe and distributed it to survivors on the street. This is the main street of Papa, Hungary, when my father returned. It's hard to see, but if you look carefully, you'll see a flag. It's the Russian hammer and sickle. The same people who a year ago were waving swastikas and killing Jews were now saying they were Russians and telling everybody how they had tried to help their Jewish friends. My father looked for survivors, and there were none from his family. And none of his friends wanted much to do with him. He decided to escape and come to America. America was the land of his dreams, and to the day he died, he never forgot the tens of thousands of Americans who gave their lives to save his when their homeland wasn't threatened. He came up with a plan to escape from the Russians, who were in many ways as brutal as the Germans. He told a friend that he was going to leave from behind this building at a given time. He knew the friend would run right to the authorities, who paid bounties of food and money for that information. And when the time came, they were waiting for him, but my father's plan had worked. He had left 3 days earlier. He made his way across Europe, walking, hitchhiking, and on a stolen motorcycle to the displaced persons camp in Ulm, Germany. If you look carefully at his picture at the camp, you'll notice that the suit he's wearing was sewn out of a U.S. Army blanket. He found out that Yugoslavs had a higher quota for immigration than Hungarians did, so he applied as a Yugoslav, and sure enough, his petition was granted in 6 months. Many Hungarians waited over 5 years. On December 31st, 1946, he boarded the SS Ernie Pyle in Bremen Harbor. And when he walked on the ship, he swore he would never think or talk about his past again. When he arrived in New York, he had enough money to buy a loaf of bread. He didn't speak English. He had no trade or advanced education. He had a strong will to move forward. And somewhere in this picture, we think that's him arriving in New York Harbor. He's waving a flag and smiling as his mind transitioned from his horrible past to the great adventure that lay ahead. The first thing he did in America was learn English by going to the movie theaters and watching Gunga Din for 10 hours a day for 30 days. And after a month, he spoke English without an accent. Even, Bill and Fred and some of the other people who knew him, you couldn't detect an accent. And then he got a big break. He was drafted into the U.S. Army and assigned to the Signal Corps, where he learned motion picture photography. I told you all that survival was due to preparation and instinct and will, but there was also luck. His unit was assigned to film the nuclear test in the Nevada desert. As a Hungarian, he wasn't allowed to go. 6 months later, everybody in this picture, but my father, was dead. They had been too close to the detonations, and they were killed by leukemia from radiation poisoning. After he was discharged, he knew that movies were going to be his career, and he looked for months without success. Most of you are too young in this audience to remember Sergeant Bilko or Phil Silvers, but he got his big break walking onto the set of the Phil Silvers show on a Friday, looking for work. They told him there was a new piece of camera equipment that no one could run, and asked him if he could run it. His answer was he was the best they ever saw, so they told him to show up to work Monday and they would give him a chance. Of course, he'd never seen the equipment or heard of it before. What he did was he hid in the studio over the weekend and practiced with it, and by Monday he was the best they ever saw. His career had started. Ed Sullivan took him to Cuba to film Castro's first interview. When they arrived, none of their equipment worked on the Cuban electrical grid. My father filmed the interview with Fidel Castro that was shown on national TV by putting his finger in the reel and advancing the film by hand. And no one who watched the interview on national TV even noticed. He got an Emmy nomination on the set of Shogun, that's him in the red jacket. Before he went, he learned to speak Japanese, which was his fifth language after Hungarian, Russian, German, and English. And during the filming, he saved a man's life. In the earthquake scene, the trench with explosives didn't detonate, and the stuntman climbed in to figure out why. And of course, as soon as he did, they detonated him and buried him under 20 feet of debris. Everybody panicked except my father, who never panicked. And he figured out a way to rig a lever arm with a boulder and a long piece of timber to dig the man out. He saved his life, and this picture shows up in the book, The Making of Shogun. While filming Rambo First Blood with Sylvester Stallone, there was a cave scene, and my father lit it in an unorthodox way with just a candle. When Sylvester saw the footage, he came running over to my father and said, "Andy, I'm the star, and nobody can see my face." My father said, "Don't worry, everybody knows who you are." And that scene became a famous scene copied by many cinematographers. A big part of this story is my father chose to keep his past life a secret from his wife, kids, and the rest of the world for 50 years. 50 years to the date that he arrived in New York Harbor, this book arrived at my doorstep. Why did he keep a secret? Maybe he didn't want to relive his past. Maybe he thought it was too much for us to process, or that it might define our lives and make us feel like victims. And he could have been right. When my daughter, Andrea Laszlo, Exeter class of '04, read the book as a 12-year-old, she had a panic attack and couldn't breathe. We had to take her to the hospital. My first reaction when I read the book was shock, because I had seen Holocaust pictures and dismissed them, and now I realized I could have been looking at my father. And then I felt foolish because there were so many signs I should have recognized. I called him on the phone. He was in New York and I was in Montana. And it was awkward. He was concerned how his oldest child might feel. I told him that I loved him and was proud to be his son. And from 2,000 miles away, I could feel the angst of 50 years falling off his shoulders. After he shared a secret, he became a famous member of the Holocaust community. He was invited with Senator Lieberman to light a candle in the U.S. Capitol on Holocaust Remembrance Day in memory of all those who perished during the Holocaust. And one of the other guests that was honored with him was Elie Wiesel, who you've all probably read. Elie Wiesel rarely smiled until his old age. He wrote that after watching a truckload of babies, live babies, thrown into a fire, he never got a good night's sleep again. And for many survivors, the anxiety, depression, trauma, and guilt stuck with them. My father was able to move on. He would never let the actions of others define his life. So there's some takeaways and wisdom. When I first started giving this talk, I thought I was honoring my father, and then I realized that I was honoring my grandparents too, because without their advice and support, he might not have made it. My grandfather told him,
"You are not defeated until you give up." Bitterness and self-pity are the medicines of the weak. You can't help others unless you keep yourself strong.
and in the last letter he got from his mother while he was at the labor camp and she was on her way to Auschwitz, she actually handed it to someone to mail, we think, through the rail car. She wrote,
"My dear Bondi, think of us often."
and that's how she signed her last letter. This is a copy of the letter, and all of my father's letters and photos have been donated to the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum, where they're in the archives at the Smithsonian. All he had with him when he came to America were the clothes on his back, $2 of cash, and a suitcase full of letters and some of these photos that you're watching. The last piece of advice his father gave him, as I mentioned to you before, was to shave every day. And although my father didn't understand the advice, he followed it faithfully. He shaved at the labor camp. He shaved at Belsen. When he shaved, he felt clean and thought his father would be proud of him. One day when he was starving at Belsen, he shaved and he wrote,
All of a sudden, I had an epiphany. I knew that I was going to survive, that no one could break my spirit, and then at last, I understood my father's advice.
And today I understand that shaving every day was a metaphor. When you're bullied or persecuted, you need to do something to maintain your humanity. And if you do, you can be beaten, you can be killed, but you can never be defeated. I shave every day in my father's memory. My father developed cancer in 2004, and the doctor told him the average man would live for 3 to 6 months. When I asked him if he was worried, and he said no, I asked him why. He said he never considered himself to be an average man. He lived for 7 more years. When he died, he had a smile on his face. He had come to America, kept the family name alive, and had had a great career. His life was the triumph of strong will over evil, and his survival is what gave me and my family the gift of life. This is a picture of my clean-shaven father, still very weak, taken very shortly after he was liberated from Theresienstadt. This is a picture of our new family, which was taken shortly after my father shared his secret. So, one thing I hope, this has been such an honor and a pleasure for me to come back to Exeter 50 years after I graduated to share my story. And I hope that every one of you will be able to come back 50 years from now and tell the new generation of Exonians how you've used your knowledge and goodness to make the world a better place. And with that, I want to thank you for letting me share a footnote to history. And Mr. Rawson said I must utter the immortal words, senior class.